Hey everybody, happy Monday. Welcome to Sports Speak. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Lot to get to. Today's a shorter show. We're going to be focusing in more so on the Indianapolis 500, which was run without fans, but still quite the spectacle yesterday. But going to start with our SEC recap of the weekend, just quickly brushing off on everything else in sports. The surprise that I have has to be Luka Doncic stepping up in clutch. It's not like I doubted his abilities, but the fact that the Mavericks were able to steal that game from the Clippers, split the series, and the buzzer beater by Doncic, no Porzingis in the game, and Dallas now in a grand opportunity to fight with the Clippers down the stretch. I still think the Clippers are going to pull out the series, but Dallas is in a perfect position to force them to a seventh game. My expectation has to be the Mets' positive COVID tests. Not necessarily that the Mets got it, but that this is going to continue in the major leagues throughout this season. And it's kind of setting the precedent that we might see something similar in the NFL just because of this situation is very similar with football as it is in baseball. Fortunately for the Mets, they just had one player, one staffer test positive. They had to postpone the Subway Series, but no other positive tests in 4 straight days. They're ready to go for a doubleheader tomorrow against the Marlins with Jacob deGrom and probably Seth Lugo starting the 2 games, starting a wild stretch of 9 games in 8 days, including a 5-game series with the Yankees this weekend, which should be fun to watch. And then my conclusion, I'm going to go to the NASCAR side of things. And, Jimmy Johnson fans are not going to be happy with what I have to say, but I'm going to make the conclusion that Jimmy Johnson is not going to win this season. I think his best opportunity was Dover, specifically yesterday. Cliff Daniels tried to pull quite the strategy with the 2-tire stop. I mean, he was competitive and he still hung on to finish third, and he's in a good spot heading into Daytona. But unless some crazy luck happens at one of these plate races, which technically plate races in Jimmy Johnson's career haven't necessarily gone his way, I'm going to make the conclusion that Johnson does not get to victory lane, and his last win was 2017 at Dover.
Yeah, and it's funny, you look at it, how he did those last 2 days at Dover, or the last 2 races, and going into yesterday's race, he was actually above the cut line as the final driver in on points. But because William Byron outdid him in stage points yesterday, despite his third place result, now he sits 4 points out. And it does, for the record, make Daytona exciting. But you mentioned that's a track that has not been statistically good to Jimmy. Now, don't get me wrong, he's won a couple of Daytona 500s. But in particular, it's when he's gotten pole or started up in front in which Jimmy Johnson has been successful in his career in plate tracks in general, not just Daytona. And obviously, I know with the lineup being randomly drawn and such, that's not going to be the scenario that we see.
Yeah, but I will say he did finish third. I don't understand the whole formula, but the fact that he finished well and he's got a decent number of points and probably got one of the faster laps. However, they do the weird calculation now, which is just stupid. I think he will be starting somewhere near like at least the top 10, so he's not going to be coming from too far back.
No, indeed, he shouldn't be, but his big thing is staying out of trouble. And I mentioned this, I believe, the other day, Eddie, where I said that Johnson, statistically, if he gets past the first stage, he is looking very good. And if you've ever noticed, his best plate track comparison has always been Jamie McMurray, because they always are together on the track and they always seem to wreck each other when they're at a plate track. Now, obviously, Jamie McMurray's been gone now, but he still finds ways to find incidents with the one car of Kurt Busch. So it just kind of happens to work that way. But that's the kind of cars that I expect him to be around, is the Ganassi cars in the plate racing service. But I do want to start with my SEC. My biggest surprise overall, I guess you can argue this is a sport. To me, still personally, this is a sport. But how about Pat McAfee wrestling an NXT TakeOver 30 against Adam Cole? That was one of the best matches, honestly, I've ever seen from someone that has no wrestling background, was there simply for viewership. And don't get me wrong, yeah, he lost, but he put together a really good match. He took some really good bumps, made some really good moves. That was a fun match to watch, and give him a lot of credit, because I'm going to say this. If Pat gets some more, in-ring time, perhaps, he could be looking at a future wrestling career, something that not many people thought of, but he actually looks like he has the talent to do so.
Pat McAfee can do anything.
Oh, no, I mean, listen, I want him to be the quarterback of the New York Giants more than Daniel Jones, but that's not going to happen. But, you look at that, that was a big surprise, to be honest, because I don't think anyone expected anything other than that match to be a squash. And I understand wrestling is scripted, but that was still pretty awesome. My expectations, Marco Andretti not winning the the Indianapolis 500. That's expected. The man hasn't won a race in 10 years. He's been irrelevant, and I think he finished 16th, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. So starting from pole and falling apart, that's pretty much expected, unfortunately, for Marco Andretti. I know it would have been big to see him come out and win for the Andretti family after everything they've gone through in this past year. But the pole is still a huge accomplishment, but unfortunately it was expected, in my opinion, that he wasn't going to be the man that won the Indianapolis 500. And overall, in conclusion, mine's somewhat similar to yours, except the opposite direction. Jimmy Johnson will not make the 2020 NASCAR playoffs, in my opinion. Daytona, not in his numbers. I have a feeling we're going to find out early who makes it in and who doesn't. But those stage points are going to be critical, which is why I think it's going to be interesting how Jimmy Johnson plays out the race on Sunday. And if he gets a little bit too over-aggressive, like, for example, Alex Bowman did in the chase at Talladega a little while back when he was in a must-win situation, it's going to result in tragedy in which Jimmy Johnson's year could be coming to an end early.
Yeah, and first, I'll talk about each of yours. First off, Pat McAfee is a living legend, and, maybe we'll see him in WWE one day, but frankly, in terms of boxing or wrestling or whatever, I'm more excited for when Mike Tyson's coming back at 54 years old for that fight, and Nate Robinson fighting Jake Paul in the undercard. That is going to be hysterical. But moving on to the second thing, I want to talk about NASCAR briefly before we get into the Indy 500, because Thursday we're going to be doing our NFL preview, and football will be the focus. So we might as well talk a little NASCAR now. Daytona this weekend. Regular season finale. I'm hyped. You're hyped. We don't know what's going to happen. It's so much uncertainty. We haven't had this situation before where it's such a wild card race to cut off from the regular season. It had typically been either Richmond or Atlanta for the past many years. But, the Jimmy Johnson still got a chance to make the playoffs. He's only a few points out. He's got teammate William Byron above. Matt DiBenedetto, who everybody thought, he's just automatically going to make the playoffs. Well, he's struggled really since about the 4th of July and has really come back to the pack, and he's no guarantee. Clint Boyer, as long as he doesn't wreck, should be safe, and I think the other spots were clinched. But, give me somebody below the cutoff line. I know Daytona is so unpredictable, but tell me somebody you think that has a chance to get to victory lane and steal one of those spots and really shake up the playoff grid.
Well, it's honestly a great question because, the way you look at it is like this. Obviously, we know if we got to this point in the season and there was someone below the cutoff line that I felt would have won, it would have been Austin Dillon. That would have been me because you think about Daytona and all of Austin Dillon's success. But obviously, he's won a race and now he's in the chase. Mm-hmm. So, it's a tough thing. I'm going to have to say to an extent, when you look at the NASCAR playoffs and such, right now, as you mentioned, Clint Boyer 57 above. What a story would it be redemption-wise if Ryan Newman came back and won this race after nearly winning the Daytona 500, should have won the Daytona 500. And for the record, with the exception of Talladega this year, he should have won the last 3 active plate races on the Cup Series circuit, but didn't get it done. I would like to see Ryan Newman come and take Daytona and take a victory. I think he's got a great shot, but I also don't want to count out Tyler Reddick or Eric Jones. We know Eric Jones has been spectacular in especially the second Daytona race in particular in terms of his career results. And even going back to his Xfinity days, he was very good in running up in front of Daytona. I think those are ideally 2 to watch. But if I'm also being honest, I don't see a new winner if it's not them winning, because Denny Hamlin, when it comes to plate tracks, he's a fantasy must. And to be ultimately honest, the battle he has between Harvick right now for who can get most wins is pretty intriguing. But I would like to see them tied up at 7 apiece going into the chase.
Yeah, the big 2 for sure this season. And Hamlin, Him, Blaney, Keselowski, those are the names you think of when you go to a plate track, but Ryan Newman too. And I was just thinking about and looking at the average finish in the last five or so plate races. And, both the Roush guys are fourth and fifth, which is a bit of a surprise. Ryan Newman and Chris Buescher. Do not count out Buescher. He had a bad start to the season, and he had a really poor stretch around July where he wrecked at Indianapolis in that pit road incident. He had a bad race at Texas, but now Buescher has started to mount some things. He had that top five at the Daytona road course 2 weeks ago, and now he's run so well in these plate races. Got third in the Daytona 500 this year. Can he maybe work with Newman and get to the front? And I wouldn't count out the JTG cars either, because you think about how close Stenhouse came to winning at Talladega. Him and Eric Almirola were right there against Ryan Blaney coming to the checkered flag. And you mentioned Eric Jones and Tyler Reddick. I wouldn't count out Reddick either. I just think there's so many people who have a chance, and that's a product of plate racing. But Tyler Reddick, he was holding his own up there at Talladega when he won that stage, and was holding off some of the best and really making some bold moves as a rookie. And, having that fearlessness is what really helps at a plate track. But I'm going to say I agree with you. I don't think there's going to be a new winner. I still think either Hamlin or a Penske car wins. But if they don't, I'm going either Chris Buescher or Ricky Stenhouse Jr. to be the surprise winner that sneaks into the playoffs.
Yeah, and you have to notice one thing too, that if there happens to be a surprise winner, how much this shakes up everything. Because obviously we know the big story going into this week, as we've already mentioned prior, is it's going to be Johnson versus Byron and the Benedetto. But if they turn around and we have a new winner this week that's in the top 30 in points, guess what? All of a sudden, both Byron and Johnson, for example, coming into today on points, are technically now having no chance and eliminated. And it all depends on what Matt DiBenedetto does, as well as Clint Boyer. So to me, that's going to be an interesting story to follow all race long. But another name too that I also should say that we also hadn't really mentioned, that's done pretty well relatively in the plate races of late, has been Bubba Wallace. Bubba Wallace as well has done a very good job, has a big knack being up in the top 10 and competitive in that number 43. And we have to remember that 43 statistically, even with when there was Eric Almirola in the car, was a car that was always up in front and showing speed at Daytona in particular, especially in the second race of the year. So who knows, if Bubba wins, that can also be special as well.
Let's not forget the reigning winner was a Spire Motorsports car with Justin Haley. So it's Daytona. You never know what will happen, and it'll be fun to watch. But got to wrap up the show today and talk about the Indianapolis 500 because, frankly, the racing was still great. We saw a lot of action, a lot of passes for the lead, a couple of big wrecks, but it just wasn't the same watching it on TV, seeing the empty crowds. And I don't know, just to me, with NASCAR, specifically with the truck and the Xfinity races, it really doesn't feel that different when you see that. But especially, it did feel a little weird in Indianapolis when NASCAR was there. But of course, Paramount did it with the IndyCar, when typically there's 200,000 people there at the Brickyard, and seeing all the stands empty around the entire track. It's not like other tracks where there's just one main grandstand. There's stands all four corners, and seeing them completely empty was just really a strange sight. But you mentioned in your SEC Marco Andretti, and I think we can both agree, not really surprised. My surprise was that he couldn't even hold the lead into turn one. Scott Dixon took it on the initial lap. And I told you on Thursday, I thought Scott Dixon and Rosenquist were going to be really solid, and we saw that. And you also mentioned Penske, who Newgarden, he was competitive, but the rest of the Penske cars really didn't have much throughout the race. Will Power was just hanging around. Castroneves is a little past his prime, but he ran maybe about 10th a lot of the race. And Pagenaud, the reigning winner, really wasn't very competitive. And then you've got Rahal, Letterman, Lanigan Racing getting up there with Graham Rahal, and then Takuma Sato, who of course was able to hold off Dixon, got the fortunate break with the late yellow. Fortunately, also Spencer Pigot was okay after that really scary crash at the end, and Sato was able to hang on because they don't do green, white, checkered in IndyCar with that caution with 4 to go and grab his second Indy 500 win.
Yeah, and for Sato, that was a huge win essentially, because you think about what would have happened if they had a one-lap dash, for example, Eddie, in that scenario? Because Scott Dixon, he would have done anything to win. I mean, you have to think about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, Scott Dixon, and we can all agree upon this, is the greatest man that's ever stepped in the face of IndyCar in this recent generation. I mean, the success that he's had, and what really, honestly, and I've mentioned this time and time again, is deemed a somewhat semi-funded team out of Chip Ganassi Racing. He's really turned around and has made something out of his career. And everyone wants to see him win. I mean, he hadn't won since 2008. It's been 12 years now since you've seen him in victory lane in the Indy 500. And the whole race, it felt like he was going to get it. But there was stuff always holding him back, untimely yellows, everything else. Dixon diced his way through the field, but he was in the front throughout the majority of the race. But how the end of the race ended up working out, just couldn't get another chance, and that's basically how his race ended up going for him. But another name, too, I do want to mention that finished in that top 5, which was pretty impressive, was also Tino Ferrucci. Someone that, I mean, is a very good IndyCar driver, but throughout the week as well, I mean, he showed some speed, but I didn't think he really had top 5 speed. But when it came to matter, Ferrucci as well came to be a factor. Obviously, I know Graham Rahal, I believe, came home in 3rd place. But you're starting to see some drivers that are getting those results that they need here in the Indy 500, especially when it matters, especially if they've been having slow weeks. I mean, even Patrick O'Ward, 6th result as well this week. So, I mean, those are 2 guys I would say that didn't, like I said, had top-notch showings throughout the first week and a half. But they turned around come race day and they made it matter.
Yeah, really a mix of rookies and veterans when you looked at the top 10. I mean, Castroneves and Kanaan coming back and racing well as they always do in the Indy 500. But you mentioned O'Ward. Colton Herta had a good run. He has not done that well in IndyCar since he got that really surprising win at Circuit of the Americas last year to become the youngest ever IndyCar winner. O'Ward was fast throughout the race. I was just overall impressed with the rookies. They did have some rookie mistakes like Rinus VeeKay when he had the pit road incident and lost a lot of time. But Oliver Askew before his big crash had a lot of speed. Just you can tell that there's a next generation of IndyCar drivers because, the old class of IndyCar like Dixon and Sato and Power and Hunter Ray, they're starting to age out, and we're going to start seeing the next generation of IndyCar drivers, and they really got the opportunity to show themselves. But the one thing that made me happiest this entire day was that we had 2 frightening accidents that the drivers were okay. Spencer Pigot did get taken to the hospital, but left just fine that night, just went, for observation just to get checked out because he had a whale of an accident. We'll start with the first one, which was really a fluke incident. It was right off a restart. Connor Daly spun out trying to make a 3-wide pass coming through turn 4. And then Oliver Askew behind just couldn't see in the smoke, I guess, and then went really hard into the inside wall, came back into Daly's car. And it was really good to see Askew okay because that's a part of the wall we don't typically see people hit, but head on into that inside wall at pretty high speed. But the really, really nice sign with the IndyCar safety procedures, and then the real proof of how good this windscreen is. We've seen so many unfortunate things happen in the IndyCar series between Franchitti and the late Justin Wilson and Dan Weldon and Robert Wickens. There's been so many incidents that have just, over the last 10 years, have kind of overshadowed the sport. And we almost had another one with Spencer Pigot, the final caution of the race where he lost control and then went into the pit wall, the end that juts out, and that's not a comfortable place to hit. His car just completely sprung across the track after hitting that. He was a little shaken up and out of it afterwards, but he was okay. And with all the debris, all the tires from the end of that barrier up in the air, with his head protected, it might have saved his life.
Indeed, I'll tell you what, give Red Bull in particular a lot of credit for coming up with this aero screen, because let me tell you something, and I know IndyCar fans have been a little bit, harsh in regards to, well, it's not just the old open wheel racing we know, but how many drivers do you need to see get tragically killed because of something that may not even be their own fault or because of the fact that they weren't safely protected? I mean, you look at, for example, the situation with Justin Wilson, for
Hmm.
example, where he unfortunately had a tragic incident because of a piece of debris hit him in the head coming through, which don't get me wrong, it's rare, but the fact that an arrow screen would protect him from something like that. And to this point, it's really done a good job. Now, do I feel that the safety in regards is going to prevent another serious injury or incident down the road, or I should say all of them? Absolutely not. But that's the sport of racing. But it's going to prevent more and more. And just like, for example, how in the Daytona 500, where Ryan Newman, for example, his incident is being studied and further evaluated for what maybe NASCAR can add. Incidents like this in IndyCar terms do get looked into and what else they can do to help. IndyCar has done a very good job over the years of building that safety equipment, and Aero Screen was by far the biggest addition. And I have to say this, I really think, and you mentioned those two wrecks in particular, that at least definitely saved Pigott's life, no
Hmm.
doubt. I'm not sure about the other one in regards to, because it was head on inside wall, but in that situation for Pigott, that definitely was a huge factor, and good to see that he was safe and okay. But I think IndyCar is going to continue to improve upon it in the future, and I'm really glad as well, Eddie, that everyone's been safe this year, because a lot of the things that could have gone wrong, especially at the faster tracks, that they'll see. So far, it's been a success. And if you're minimizing injury, let alone obviously, the things that you can't control in terms of injury in a race car, but the things that in aspects that they can control, that's pretty good. And they're doing a very good job in making the next step in evolution.
So I've got three more things to go over with the Indy 500. Two drivers and then one just overall arching theme thing. I'm going to start with Fernando Alonso because last year he didn't even make the race and got beaten out by a team that was barely funded. This year he gets in, apparently has all kinds of clutch problems, and he got up to 15th, fell back, ended up a lap down, and just he hasn't shown that much speed. And it really makes me wonder if because people accept Alonso as and consider him one of the great, just overall motorsports competitors in the entire world. And 2 years in the Indy 500, I know he hasn't had the best equipment, but still, he hasn't even been that competitive to start with. So what I wonder is that do you think that this Alonso fiasco with him struggling in the Indy 500 might, keep some other drivers from, like, let's say Formula One or IMSA or even NASCAR that want to try the Indy 500 kind of turn them away from doing so?
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree in that response that, yeah, it's going to keep F1 drivers away, in my opinion, because the thing is, as well, is that in particular with IndyCar contracts and teams, it's very hard for them to turn away. For example, Danica Patrick last year or was it 2 years ago now, maybe, in Danica's final ride,
Yeah.
in which her final ride in the Indy 500, where when you look at it, that's an anomaly, because she was able to get extra help when the time was right to make her one last push. But overall, that doesn't happen very often. And it's underfunded teams that are willing to take risk on these drivers and then hope that it creates sponsorship and help. In Alonso's case, it hasn't worked out like that. And I think it really had a lot to do as well with Alonso's situation prior to that transition. And the big thing is what I feel like could help Alonso, Eddie, is if he had done more than just the Indy 500. I think that would overall change the picture of, hey, this guy is a very good driver. It's not just the Indy 500 that he's coming here for and then struggling. I think Alonso needs to prove that in that regard. But every year, if he continues to just qualify for the Indy 500 and the same issues continue to occur time and time and time again, it's going to be frowned upon, and it looks bad on the F1 side, which, again, goes back to my point of I think that this really holds them back because they're only going to go to underfunded teams, and an underfunded team can only bring you so far. If you're an F1 driver, you need to have top-notch sponsorship that's willing to come with you just for that one race, and you need to make sure everyone is on board overall, and if it's with a solid team. Otherwise, you're not going to be going anywhere. And I know Alonso's a great driver, and I still agree. I still think that he is one of the best drivers in motorsports history, but he needs an opportunity to prove it in IndyCar, and I just don't think the Indy 500 in particular has made a good story or image for F1 drivers. He needs to do more than the Indy 500 to show exactly what he's made of.
Yeah, I'd like to see him on a road course. You know, he's got all this experience in Formula One racing on road courses. Come bring it to IndyCar. Show them what you got. But I'm going to go to the other end of the spectrum. Alexander Rossi crashed out of the Indy 500 and once again had some bad luck in that race that wasn't necessarily his fault for the second season in a row. But, I mean, the speed that he has and also just the willingness he has to take risks on the track is really unlike anybody else other than maybe Scott Dixon out there. And being a young driver who's already won the Indy 500, I know he hasn't had a great year so far in IndyCar. Once again, a lot of misfortune and a couple of wrecks. But do you think he's going to be the next face of IndyCar?
Yeah, I think Rossi has that potential to be the next face of IndyCar. But the other thing that we also have to look at is, when is it going to be the end for Scott Dixon? Because Scott Dixon, still to this day, until the day he retires, is going to be that face. And you have to remember, in Scott Dixon's era in particular, Scott Dixon had so many names around him, with Juan Pablo Montoya, Dario Franchitti, and all these other drivers that are incredibly talented. Not saying that this era isn't talented, because it absolutely is. But I feel like that it's not going to be just Rossi in the future that has to be that star. There's going to be other drivers, and we're seeing this young rookie class, by the way, look absolutely incredible. But overall, someone that's from this rookie class, I feel, has to step up with the veteran Rossi and overall make themselves the name of the sport. But I think he has a great future. And yes, like you mentioned, he's already won that Indy 500, something that not many people at his age were able to do. I think that's off his back. But you know what he also reminds me in terms of, you mentioned his aggressive moves, Eddie?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of reminds me a little bit of a less reckless Ricky Stenhouse when he was younger, in which he's not afraid to put his nose in, and he's not afraid to make a move because he's that confident that he's going to be successful. I think Rossi has a great future. I think he's going to continue to be successful. He just needs more names around him, like I said, for example, what Scott Dixon needed to ultimately make his class in IndyCar absolutely special.
Last thing, for anyone who doesn't really follow motorsports, this is going to be kind of weird to explain. But Roger Penske, who Penske Truck Rentals, but also he's a big-time owner in motorsports. He owns a NASCAR team, but he also owns a historic IndyCar team that's won numerous Indy 500s. He had Elio and Will Power. I mean, he's had so many talented drivers. And he bought Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And this was year one. And there are a lot of IndyCar fans who are not happy with this decision because everything originally was 50% capacity or even 25% capacity. And you see some of these major IndyCar content creators, like maybe someone like a David Land, who aren't too pleased with this decision. And so much so that a lot of these people we actually saw show up with masks on outside the track, like protesting racing fans' lives matter or whatever. Like, I feel like Roger Penske now, and it's not all his fault because in some ways you really don't want too many people at the Indy 500. But at the same time, science already proved Bristol, which had been more of a concerning situation, and not everyone was wearing masks there, that there has not been an outbreak that came from the All-Star race. So, you know, the data was there to show that if this was done correctly, that this could work. And with how he could spread people out because of how big of a facility he had, I think there was a way they could have done at least some spectators there. But do you think he's kind of started things off here on the wrong foot as now he has more of an influence in IndyCar?
I mean, I guess in a fan's perspective, he has, quote unquote, started off on the wrong foot. But from an individual perspective, and you have to understand this too, the All-Star race for NASCAR you mentioned at Bristol, was that already, maybe a month ago now?
It was like 6 weeks ago now.
6 weeks, yeah. So about a month and a half, ideally. And back in a month and a half ago, things with COVID were a little bit different. Things weren't ramping up. beaches were just opening. You have to remember that and all these other things in terms of towns and cities. Well, fast forward now, we're closing in towards September, and guess what? COVID numbers have spiked up yet again. The world, I mean, I'll tell you, New York is going to probably shut down again in the next few weeks, if I'm being honest. Schools that were initially open are canceling. There's places, especially southern states, that open boundaries to everyone. They're closing back down. California, they're having issues. Even in northern places that didn't really have COVID before, now they're experiencing it. I think Roger Penske made a smart decision in regards to he wants to minimize outside individuals from coming in and making sure that they have the proper personnel for the drivers, the staff, and everyone that needs to be there. Fans don't need to be at a track. They want to be at a track, but they don't need to be at a racing surface. It's the important people that have to be there. And I think that's what fans have to realize. This wasn't an attempt at Roger Penske hates the fans. It's a matter of what he needs to have less risk for his drivers, for the fans themselves, mind you, and the staff that's at the track. Because you have to realize Bristol, don't get me wrong, is a jumbo arena. I'm not even going to say it's a racetrack itself in terms of the stands. It is an arena. But there's enough, how do I put it? The spacing is much tinier in terms of capacity than Indianapolis is. And I know science has proven that, sure, more spread out, not an issue. But you have to have enough staff that can cover that 6+ miles around the track. It's not worth it for Roger Penske. It becomes too much of an issue, which is why I think for fans, you have to realize he was making a better decision to keep everyone safe and just be ready for next year. If there is, of course, fans able to happen next year, because we don't know what's going to happen with COVID. But come back next year poised to see a good Indy 500, because I think the product of racing next year will be so much better than it already was this year. And in my opinion, this year was a pretty good Indy 500 compared to the ones of late.
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't get a green flag ending, but obviously with Spencer Pigot's health as a concern, you understood that, especially since they had to repair the pit wall after he crashed into the barriers. But Takuma Sato did take home his second win. And just wrapping up on what you said, I understand where you're coming from. But I think if personally, I mean, I'm not a huge IndyCar fan, but if I was someone who was like a passionate person who goes to Indianapolis Motor Speedway, I would understand his decision if he was concerned about safety or, like you said, not having enough staff. But the fact that there was a lot of positivity originally about everything, about as much as 50% crowd size, and that it just kept going lower and lower, I just wish there wouldn't have been as much optimism initially. But then again, I do understand the uncertainty with COVID. That's kind of hard to make predictions out like beforehand.
Well, I do have to ask the question, didn't Penske's team in particular have an outbreak? Maybe it was on the NASCAR side, maybe it was on Indianapolis, but didn't they have a minor outbreak in their shop for COVID-19?
Back early on, it was right around, I think, when NASCAR came back. So I think it was a NASCAR thing around like mid to late May that they had a couple crew members that were at the shop tested positive.
Yeah, because the reason why I'm saying is that, and I forgot when that was, but I had a feeling that that happened. Perhaps, too, that could have had a play in regards to more information that he's learned from those instances and maybe other things, because you have to remember, Penske's involved in multiple terms of motorsports. So he may be getting information and data from many different people, and that ultimately led him to make a decision, because usually Roger Penske, when he does make a decision, he's stuck to that decision. He sticks to his word. But there was something that he felt wasn't right. And to me, he made the right decision. I can understand why motorsports fans are mad, but I trust Roger Penske. If he feels fans shouldn't have been there, there has to be a pretty good reason.
Well, even though nobody was at the track, they got to see quite the show on TV as Takuma Sato went to victory lane. So we will be back on Thursday, and it's the much hyped up NFL preview. We'll be bringing it back to Zoe Alter, who will probably be very passionate about her Detroit Lions. I'll try to convince her otherwise, but should be fun. We'll be discussing predictions for the season, standings, Super Bowl predictions, along with awards predictions. It's going to be a fun show. You will not want to miss it. Thursday night at 7 o'clock. Until then, I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Wishing you a great rest of your week here on Sports Speak.